Cubamajigs are reusable gaming packs for cube sideboards and other games. New designs from your favorite MTG artists are launched every Monday, so go check them out at cubamajigs.com.
Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another edition of Brewer's Minute. So this week, we're going to talk about a very timely and important topic, and that is mana in Standard. So basically, now that we have Ravnica Allegiance, we have all 10 shocklands to go along with all 10 checklands and some other lands. So how do you build a mana base in Standard from 1 colors all the way up to 4 colors? That's our topic for today. Basically, how to build your Standard mana base. So a quick reminder before we break down Standard mana. If you enjoy Brewer's Minute and the other series here on the channel, it would be amazing of you if you could take a second, click that subscribe button down at the bottom of your screen. It's a great way to support the channel and the site for free. So let's start with an easy one. Monocolored mana bases, and monocolored mana bases, they're about as easy as it gets. If you're playing mono red, mono blue, mono white, whatever, you could just play all basic lands of the proper color. So that is the simplest explanation of monocolored mana. However, there are some considerations for your 1 color deck. We don't have a ton of utility lands that are playable in Standard, but there are a few that are worth mentioning. So if you're building a monocolored deck, a 1 color deck, there are a couple of utility lands to keep in mind. First off, we have the Cycle of Memorials from Dominaria, and all these cards are at least in the conversation if you're building a monocolored deck. Memorial to Folly is the best. Actually, they're kind of displayed from best to worst. The green one, not pictured because I don't think I've ever seen anyone play it. It's not very good. But Memorial to Folly, if you're in mono black, you should probably be playing it. Memorial to Genius, this is where things get a little bit questionable. The rest of the Memorials, they are good in decks that don't mind having tap lands. So if you're playing a mono blue control deck or mid-range deck, or the same with Memorial to Glory, Memorial to War, if you're playing white control, white mid-range, red control, then all these cards are very good. On the other hand, if you're playing mono red aggro, the cost of playing a tap Memorial to War is too much to make it worth the effect of blowing up a land sometimes if the game goes really long. But they're all in the conversation. As far as mono black, we have an additional consideration in Cabal Stronghold, which is actually one of the biggest payoffs for playing an all swamp mana base. So if you're playing mono black and you're playing anything that's on the mid-range to control side, definitely worth considering. Although if you're playing Cabal Stronghold, you want to minimize the number of non-swamp lands in your deck because Cabal Stronghold only triggers on basic swamps. Finally, we have our colorless options, and here there's 3 main ones. Number 1, we have Field of Ruin. It's a really nice option for monocolor decks to deal with, like Search for Azcanta, other flipped enchantments. You can even just get people sometimes by cutting them off of a color, like the blue-white aggro deck doesn't play any islands, so you can potentially strip mine your opponent, or Field of Ruin your opponent, I guess. It's not really a strip mine because they get a plains, but you can cut a person off of a color in some matchups with Field of Ruin. Arch of Araska, if you're playing a slower deck, definitely worth considering. Zalfred's Void, I almost didn't include it. It doesn't really show up, but if you're playing a color that doesn't have much card advantage, and you're playing a deck that probably won't get enough permanents to activate Arch of Araska, then Zalfred's Void kind of comes into the conversation as a way to just kind of improve your draws a little bit. So that's monocolored mana. Focus on all basic lands, throw in some utility lands if you have the ability to, if they work well in your deck. Then we have 2-color mana, and 2-color mana is also super simple. So 2-color mana is built around 4 shocklands, 4 checklands, Breeding Pool, Hinterland, Harbor. The big question is, should you play additional dual lands with the cost being that they come into play tap? You see Simic, Guildgate, Woodland Stream. Is it worth it to up the number of dual lands if it means you have to play these tap lands? Because every 2-color deck is going to have 4 of the on-color shockland, 4 of the on-color checkland. The answer here is a little bit complicated. I would say, in general, the answer is no, but there are exceptions. And basically, if you're playing a more aggressive deck, you don't want the tap lands. You would rather have slightly worse mana and have all your lands come into play untapped. On the other hand, if you're playing a really slow control deck without much to do on turn 1, then you can get away with maybe 1 to 2 tap dual lands and improve your mana that way. So, for example, Gruul Aggro, it's a deck with some pretty tough mana costs. You want green on turn 1, you get up to double red on turns 4 and 5. You don't play tap lands in this deck. It's not worth it. You'd rather just have your lands come into play untapped. The same is true of Azorius aggro. You don't really want tap lands in a deck that's looking to be aggressive. On the other hand, if you're playing a deck like Simic Nexus, which doesn't have much going on in the early turns, you could sneak in a couple of guild gates, make your mana a little bit better. Same is true of Rakdos mid-range. You can afford a couple of tap dual lands because your deck isn't trying to curve out, and that is the biggest determining factor with two-color decks. So two-color mana, start with 4 shocklands, 4 checklands, and then think, how aggressive is this deck? How much do I need my deck to curve out? If the answer is, I need to curve out, I'm aggressive, just play basics for the rest of your lands. On the other hand, if you are saying, okay, I'm slower, I don't really care as much about curving out, you can play up to 2 tap dual lands, whether that be the guild gates or the other tap dual cycle. They're basically the same unless you have some random gate synergies. So that's 2-color mana. 3-color mana is also pretty simple in our current standard format. So 3-color mana bases are actually fairly uniform for the most part. So step 1, you have 12 shocklands. So this is a mana base. You get 4 breeding pools, 4 hallowed fountains, 4 temple gardens. So that's step 1. That gets you to 12 lands. Then you have the checklands, and here you're looking at somewhere in the range of 10 to 11. So you're going to play, you could play all 4 if you're playing like a 26 land deck, but the main goal here is to have all 12 shocklands, have as many of the 12 checklands as possible, while still having room for about 2 basic lands, because having a couple of basic lands is actually pretty important. It is not a good plan if you're playing 24 lands to play 12 shocks, 12 checklands, no basics, and that's because there are some things in standard that care about you having basic lands in your deck. Like Assassin's Trophy, you really want 1 or 2 basic lands to be able to tutor up a land when that happens, because it's really brutal if you can't. Same with Settle the Wreckage. Having a couple basics you can find is good. In Field of Ruin, if you go super greedy and play literal 0 basic lands, you just get strip mined by Field of Ruin, which is something you want to avoid. So for 3-color mana, go for 12 shocklands, 10 to 12, depending on the total number of lands in your deck, checklands, and then about 2 basic lands is the norm. So as for examples, you can see Bant Nexus here, for example, a 3-color deck that is basically built on this formula. This one's actually a little bit of an exception. It only plays 11 shocklands. It goes 11 shocklands, minus 1 temple garden, 11 checklands, minus 1 sun petal grove, 2 basic lands, and 1 Arch of Araska for 26 lands in all. Esper Control, this is an example of exactly what we're talking about. You can see the beautifully uniform mana base, and this one gets away with playing 12 shocks in 12 checklands because it's playing 26 lands altogether. So if you're playing 26 lands, you can get away with 12, 12, and still have 2 basics. On the other hand, there is one exception to the rule in Standard, and that is if you're playing a Llanowar Elf deck. So if you're playing a deck like Sultai midrange, and this is worth talking about, I think, because Sultai midrange is so popular, you need to consider the amount of untapped green mana that you have on turn 1 to play your Llanowar Elves. So this means a deck like Sultai midrange actually trims back a little bit on its mana fixing. You can see only 2 Drowned Catacombs, for example, and in place of some of those extra dual lands, it plays more untapped forest, essentially, to maximize the odds of being able to play turn 1 Llanowar Elves. So if you have turn 1 plays that are really essential to the theme of your deck, that's when you have to make some exceptions to the general rule. But in general, if you're building 3 colors in Standard, 12 shocklands, 10 to 12 checklands, depending on the total number of lands in your deck, but make sure to have room for 2 basic lands, because you will get punished and lose games to Assassin's Trophy and Field of Ruin if you don't. So that's 1 color, 2 color, 3 color. We're up to 4 color. Not going to talk 5 color today. So 4 color mana bases, and this one's a little bit trickier because we don't have any current tier 4 color decks outside of the gate deck, which is its own thing because it's built around lands and built around gates in specific. So if you want to build a 4 color mana base, there's basically 2 easy ways to go about it. So number 1 is a monocolor 4 color mana base. So this is a really easy one. If you are a deck that has 1 base color, like for in this example it's green, then you can just kind of splash 3 colors off of that. So for example, every land in this deck taps for green mana, and then you squeeze in about 7 blue sources, about 7 or 8 white sources, 8 black sources, and have the full 3 colors. And the nice thing about this mana base is it actually works pretty well. You're essentially guaranteed to have your base color every single game. You're going to have your green mana because if you you have any lands, they're going to tap for green. As far as your splash colors, the math is a little bit weird. So with 8 dual lands in your deck of a color, 8 sources of a color, you're roughly 65% to have that color in your opening hand. However, if you go to like turn 5, when you've drawn 12 cards, then it goes up to 85%. So your chances of having a color every game on turn 1 kind of low in a 4-color mana base like this, but your chances of having that mana in the late game, if you're splashing for some finishers, some late game removal, whatever, is still pretty high. So you can get away with that kind of splash in a base 1-color deck. The other way to build a 4-color mana base is basically a 2-color double splash mana base. And in this example, we're a base Azorius deck, so blue-white base. So we have 4 Hallowed Fountain, 4 Glacial Fortress, a Plains and an Island, and then we're basically splashing green and red off of shocklands and checklands, which gives us slightly less mana of each of our splash colors. We don't have as many duals for red and green. However, we have more duals for 2 colors. So if we need to have white and blue every game, this is going to make sure that we have that while still not reducing our odds of hitting our splash colors too much. And the math here is we're roughly 90% to have white and blue in our opening hand. So we're still not quite as high as the mono green 4-color mana base. So there is that 10% where we're going to be color screwed and we can miss a color, but 90% is still a pretty good rate for our opening hand. But the rate of our splash colors in our opening hand drops from like just over 65% down to around 60%. So we will have a little bit more trouble hitting our splash colors. Although again, if you look at like turn 5, you've drawn a few cards, you still get up to around 80% of having a splash color by that time, which makes it fine if you're splashing 4 late game cards again. So with this mana base, you're going to be pretty guaranteed to have your Azorius mana consistently because all of your lands are tapping for either white or blue, but you're a little less likely to hit those extra splash colors. But if you're playing a 2-color deck with multiple splashes, this is still the easiest way to go about it. Anyway, I think that's mana for standard. I'm not even going to try 5-color decks. 5-color decks, they're so contextual that it's not very easy to just do a blanket 5-color mana base. You're going to want a lot of shocks, you're going to want a lot of checks, but it's going to basically be based on the individual composition of your deck and what colors have multiple colored mana costs in your deck and so forth. So it's not easy to just build a blanket 5-color mana base. So anyway, I hope this was helpful. Breaking down how to build mana in standard, some of the considerations for it, and this is going to be good for a while, all the way up to rotation. I don't expect, other than maybe some utility lands, I don't think we're going to get a cycle of dual lands that's going to replace the checklands and the shocklands before rotation in October. So other than the stuff we talked about at the very beginning of the video, with like some colorless utility lands, we'll probably get some stuff like that. This is the basic formula for building 2, 3, 4-color mana from now all the way through the unnamed fall set releases, the end of September, beginning of October. So anyway, that's been Standard Mana. That's been our Brewers Minute for this week. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it was helpful. I hope you enjoyed it. If you got any questions, any feedback, let me know in the comments. Thanks again for watching, and I will talk to you soon.
Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.